So hi everybody, I'm Rick Beyer, and I am the Ghost Army tour guide for Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, as well as the author of the co-author, I should say, of the book The Ghost Army of World War II, and the producer of the Ghost Army documentary. And I appreciate your coming to the webinar today, and also want to thank Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours and Carrie Williamson there for hosting the webinar. And our topic today is two brilliant deceptions, Operation Fortitude and the Ghost Army. I talk about the Ghost Army all around the country, all around the world, and constantly there's confusion about whether the Ghost Army is the same thing as Operation Fortitude. In fact, people come to talks that I give thinking they're going to hear about Operation Fortitude, which is the D-Day deception, when in fact I'm talking about the Ghost Army. People ask me, well, wait a minute, isn't the Ghost Army part of Operation Fortitude? Aren't they really done by the same people? How are those connected? And so I thought it would be a great idea to do a webinar today where we talk about these different operations and clarify what makes them different, but then also talk about the connections between them, because there are a few fascinating connections between these operations, which are probably what has led to some of the confusion about them. So I'm going to jump in and get going on that. And I'm going to start out by talking about Operation Fortitude. Operation Fortitude, also known as the D-Day deception, was designed to fool the Germans about where the Allied invasion of Europe would take place in 1944. Now, the actual invasion was going to take place here, crossing the English Channel and landing in Normandy. But of course, we didn't really want the Germans to know that that's what we were going to do. And so Fortitude was designed to convince them that the invasion would take place here, across the very shortest part of the English Channel, landing at a part of France known as Pas de Calais. And why we were trying to convince the Germans the landing would take place there is because it's where the Germans expected the landing. In deception, it's always easier to convince somebody of something that they already want to believe. So in this case, the Germans wanted to believe it was going to happen there. It's what made sense to them, and so that's why Operation Fortitude was designed to show that. That was actually Operation Fortitude South. There is also an Operation Fortitude North that posited that there was a force gathering in Scotland that was preparing to attack Norway. And the reason that this operation took place, this particular part of Operation Fortitude, is that the Germans had about 12 divisions in Normandy. And nobody on the Allied side wanted these divisions to come down and reinforce the German forces down here in France. And so that's why Operation Fortitude North took place, to hold those forces here in Norway. Excuse me. So that's Operation Fortitude. By contrast, the Ghost Army is actually the story of a U.S. Army unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a battlefield deception unit designed to fool the Germans about the location of American units on the battlefields of Europe. So at various times, the Ghost Army is doing deceptions in Normandy or in Brittany, over on the border of Germany and Luxembourg here, eventually up here near Dusseldorf. About 21 deceptions in all, and each of these deceptions, the Ghost Army is impersonating another American Army unit, whether it's the 6th Armored Division or the 75th Infantry Division, and trying to fool the Germans about where that unit is so that the Germans will move their forces the way that we want them to. So those are the two operations in a nutshell. And I thought that the most useful way to talk about their differences is to compare them on all these elements. The scale of the operation, who controlled the operation, the focus of the operation, the location, duration, means, and missions. So, okay, that's what I'm going to look at. This is Operation Fortitude. The scale is strategic, so it involves the whole theater. This is it's a really large-scale operation. The control of the operation is entirely British. There are some different British Army organizations involved with this. It ends up coming primarily under the 21st Army Group and General Montgomery, but it's all British controlled. The focus of this deception is, of course, the invasion, and it's carried out in Britain. None of this happens anyplace else, pretty much, except for Britain. And the duration of this deception is about 7 months, because it really starts in December, January of end of 1943, beginning of 1944, and it goes until after the D-Day landings. Actually, it continues on to about July of 1944. And the means of the deception, the most important means of it were the double-cross system of spies in Britain, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Radio deception, sending out fake radio signals, pretending that there are units gathering to cross at the Pas de Calais. Some inflatable decoys, and our good friend General George Patton, who was actually named as the commander of the fake the fake 1st U.S. Army Group. And as commander of that, he was sort of a deception force all by himself, because the 1st U.S. Army Group didn't exist. It's the force we wanted the Germans to think was going to land at the Pas de Calais. Now, comparing Operation Fortitude to the Ghost Army, the Ghost Army it was involved in tactical deceptions. These are smaller scale, much smaller scale battlefield deceptions lasting a very short time, not affecting the entire theater. It was entirely an American unit. It was controlled by American officers. It was staffed entirely by American GIs, and it only impersonated American units. The focus was post-invasion. They went into action after D-Day. They're actually operating on the ground in Europe, in France, in Luxembourg, in Belgium, and in Germany. And most of their deceptions, unlike the length of the Fortitude deceptions, the Ghost Army deceptions are short. Some of them last as little as 24 or 36 hours. Their longest one lasted about 8 days. And their means of deception here are sonic deception. They had radio deception again, decoys, and what they called special effects, which was physical deception, where the soldiers were putting on the patches of the unit they're impersonating. They're putting the bumper markings of the unit they're impersonating, and they're setting up phony headquarters and the like to fool any spies left behind by the Germans. And then, very important here, as opposed to one mission that Operation Fortitude had, which was to fool people about the D-Day deception, the Ghost Army carries out 21 different deception missions on the ground in Europe. And I would just note here, so they both involved radio and they both involved decoys. And I think some of the confusion that happens here is that people then assume that the Ghost Army soldiers must have been doing some of this radio deception, or must have been doing some of the decoy deception for Operation Fortitude. And with one exception that I'll talk about, that's just not the case. The radio deception for Operation Fortitude was carried out by other units. There was another American radio unit, the 3103rd, that did radio deception for Operation Fortitude. The Ghost Army radio operators did not. The Ghost Army soldiers, by and large, did not set up the decoys used by Operation Fortitude. So that's a side-by-side comparison of the two deceptions. And before I talk about the connections between them, I just want to highlight one interesting, unique part of each of these deceptions for those of you who may not know about them. Operation Fortitude depended very heavily on the double-cross system. The British had actually turned Nazi agents in Britain, and they used them to spread misinformation to the Germans. So the Germans thought they had all these spies in England, But in fact, all those spies had been turned by the British. They were now double agents. They were now working for Britain and feeding back false information to the Germans. And probably the best known of the double-cross spies was Agent Garbo, Juan Pujol Garcia. And he actually approached Britain. He was Spanish. He approached Britain in 1940 about working for their intelligence agency, and he was rejected. So he ends up going to work for the Germans, who sent him to England as a spy, and there he contacts British intelligence again and convinces them that he can be their double agent. And Garbo was amazing. He actually created a network of 24 fictitious agents. So the Germans thought that he controlled this vast spy network in England. It was all imaginary. One unique and interesting part of the Ghost Army that I want to talk about is sonic deception. So you know, of course, you probably know that the Ghost Army used their inflatable tanks to fool the Germans, and they used radio trickery to fool the Germans. But one of their most unique and successful deception means was using recorded sound to fool the enemy. They actually created sound effects records and then brought them to Europe, and then they could create from them different shows of tanks moving in or trucks moving in, troops moving in, that they could play at night in coordination with their other means of deception to fool the enemy. And these shows were recorded. The tape recorder really didn't exist yet, but the predecessor to the tape recorder did. It's called the wire recorder. And the shows were recorded on magnetized wire. And I'm trying to show you some here, and I think it's tricky to see it. But if I hold it up close, you can see that I'm not lying. I am actually holding something in my hand. This is about the thickness of fishing wire, and about 6 feet of it is 1 second of sound, so about 2 miles of it is 30 minutes of sound, which was what one reel contained. And so they used these, and they played these sound effects out of these 500-pound speakers that had a theoretical range of 15 miles. It's interesting, I've been visiting sites of Ghost Army operations and looking at their maps and trying to understand things more deeply, and they really often pushed the sonic company way up near the front to make sure that they would be heard by the Germans. So sometimes there was very little in the way of troops between these sonic trucks, sonic half-tracks, and the Germans. So that was a pretty risky business. So okay, we have the two different deceptions. What are the connections between them? Well, the first connection I want to talk about is these two guys, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And these are American Army officers working in the Special Plans branch of the U.S. Army in London in 1943 and 1944, working eventually under Omar Bradley there. And they are deception officers. And they are the guys who created the Ghost Army. They dreamed up the idea of the Ghost Army. But they also coordinated the American aspects of Operation Fortitude. So as you can imagine, if you're doing a big deception mission, it has to be very carefully coordinated. So the British deception planners came up with their ideas and their ways of doing things. And then when they needed help from the Americans, it went through these two officers, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And these guys are fascinating. Ralph Ingersoll is a special favorite of mine. He was a civilian publisher, author, a controversial left-wing journalist who's drafted into the Army, becomes an officer, ends up working in intelligence. He's really bright. He's also a huge egotist and has a reputation of being a liar. I always say this is the perfect pedigree for a deception officer. He's smart and he's a good liar. And he's working with Billy Harris, and Billy Harris is the exact opposite. He's a button-down, very military, straight arrow guy, went to West Point. Everybody in his family went to West Point. He became a general eventually. Actually, in the Korean War, Billy Harris commanded the 7th Cavalry, which was Custer's old unit. He did a much better job than Custer, I might add. And so these two guys working together created the Ghost Army, and they also coordinated the American aspects of Operation Fortitude. So in some ways, what they were learning through their work on Operation Fortitude helped to inform them as they created and then set into motion the Ghost Army. So that's one connection between the two units. A second connection involves decoys. It's slightly convoluted to get there, but bear with me for a few seconds and I'll explain what I'm talking about. So both of these deceptions use decoys. The Ghost Army, of course, uses inflatable tanks and trucks and the like to fool the Germans on the battlefields of Europe. Operation Fortitude uses inflatable landing craft, what they call the Big Bobs, many inflatable landing craft that they had tied up in harbors along the English Channel. Fortitude North in Scotland also used inflatable airplanes to make it seem like a large air armada was assembling there to attack Norway. But contrary to much of what you may have heard, Operation Fortitude did not use inflatable tanks. And I realize in saying this, I'm speaking heresy, because if you've read any of, there are dozens of books about Operation Fortitude that say they did use inflatable tanks. And if you saw the movie The Eye of the Needle, the spy is running around in East Anglia seeing dummies that he wants to report back to Germany. So in fiction and in history, people have claimed that Operation Fortitude used these inflatable tanks. But in fact, David Strangeways, who was the brilliant British deception officer, and parenthetically, let me say, what a great name for a deception officer, Strangeways. The guy who designed Operation Fortitude did not want to use inflatable tanks, did not want to use any physical means of deception except for the inflatable landing craft and some headquarters buildings that were set up, because he thought it was too easily seen through, that it might create problems, that it might hurt the deception, and that it was unnecessary. And so these were not used as part of Operation Fortitude. So why does everybody think that they were used? Well, one reason may have to do with the Ghost Army. So in May and June of 1944, from May 29th to June 3rd, the Ghost Army conducts training exercises with their inflatable tanks and trucks. Operation Cabbage, Operation Cheese, and Operation Spam. It's 3 days of training exercises. Now, the Ghost Army at this point is bivouacked about here at Walton Hall, which we visit on the Ghost Army tour, and we'll be there in a couple of months. But the training exercise they do is way over here in Thetford. So why do they travel practically across England to do this training exercise in Thetford? Well, Thetford is in the build-up area where we're trying to convince the Germans that troops are gathering for this invasion across the channel at Pas de Calais. So speculation would be that they thought that as long as they're going to do the training exercise, they'll do it in the place where we're already trying to convince the Germans that there's going to be a build-up. And so they brought their inflatable units all to Thetford across England, and in these exercises in the Thetford area, they impersonated an armored division and an infantry division. And they did it basically about here. I have been spending a lot of time lately with the maps in the National Archives. We have a project that we're doing as part of the Ghost Army Legacy Project, where we're trying to map individual operations and then take these maps and overlay them onto Google Maps so that people can actually go to these spots, find them themselves. We've already done that for Operation Bettenberg, there's a link on the Ghost Army Legacy Project website. And we're going to be doing that for this operation and some others as well. And so the question kind of arises, is it really fair to call this a training exercise, simply a training exercise, if it happened in the area where we're trying to convince the Germans that there was a buildup? Or is it really, should we say it really is part of Operation Fortitude, and should we perhaps consider it the Ghost Army's first legitimate operation? I certainly don't think they were fooling a lot of Germans at that point. There wasn't a lot of German aerial reconnaissance there at that time. But it ended up, of course, being done in the area where we wanted the Germans to think there was a buildup, so it played a small part in it. The third connection between these two deceptions that I want to talk about is General George Patton. Now, George Patton is deeply involved in the Fortitude deception. He is the commander of the notional 1st U.S. Army Group, notional being a U.S. Army term for fake, okay? So he's the commander of this fake Army group that we want the Germans to think is there in England. He makes visits to facilities that are supposedly part of this big buildup. And one of the most interesting things that he does is that there's a German general named Hans Kramer, and he's very sick. He has asthma, and he's being repatriated. He's being traded back to Germany. The deception officers arrange for him to travel through the area where troops are building up in England, but they convince him that it's not, where it actually is, but that it's over in the area that we want them to think the 1st U.S. Army Group is. And he has dinner with General Patton, thinking that he's having dinner with the commander of this 1st U.S. Army Group, and maybe Patton drops a hint or two about what's going on, and that the invasion, maybe mentions Pas-de-Calais. Anyway, Patton is deeply involved in the Fortitude deception as part of trying to convince the Germans that this is a real operation and that the real landings are going to take place there. Now, Patton's also very involved with the Ghost Army. Most Ghost Army operations end up being for Patton's 3rd Army. Ghost Army does not work for the 3rd Army. They work for the 12th U.S. Army Group, but most of their deceptions are for Patton's 3rd Army. And my research has shown that on at least 2 occasions, Patton met with Major Ralph Ingersoll to sharpen plans for particular deceptions that were going on in Operation Brittany and Operation Kodak. And the last connection here is a little more iffy, but very interesting to me. I've talked to so many Ghost Army veterans. It seems like everyone has a story about having met General George Patton. So it seems that there are a lot of connections between the Ghost Army and General Patton. So what's going on here? Now, Patton has this reputation. He's gruff, he's vulgar, he's got the ivory-handled pistols, he curses all the time. And in the movie Patton, he seems to be very angry about his role heading the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, angry that he's being used in the deception role. But let's now consider something that one of the deception planners, Billy Harris, said about General George Patton after the war. He said, "He was the greatest team player that we ran into over there. He would do anything you asked him to do in the interest of the overall picture." And I've always thought this is a great window onto Patton's generalship. He wanted to win. He knew that deception was an important tool. He embraced deception both in Operation Fortitude and on the battlefields of Europe after the war. And it's one of the things that helped his 3rd Army succeed, and one of the things that helped, of course, the entire Allied effort succeed in Normandy. When we look at the impact of Fortitude in the Ghost Army, the impact of Fortitude is very obvious. We fooled the Germans completely. They thought the invasion was going to come at Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was relatively lightly held. It's harder to judge the impact and the success of the Ghost Army, in part because it's 21 different deception missions. Some were more successful than others. But it's always been clear to me that there are some big successes there. Their last deception, Operation Viersen, was widely judged a major success. Operation Bettenberg was a success. Brittany was a success. So I think on balance, the Ghost Army also has to be judged overall as being very successful, because it certainly saved American lives. By some estimates, 15 to 25,000 American lives saved in Ghost Army operations. And I'm very, when I sum up the Ghost Army, I often refer to a quote by a U.S. Army analyst about 30 years after the war, Mark Croneman, who said, "Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. So I hope I've cleared up a few differences between Fortitude and the Ghost Army. And I'm just about ready to take questions, but as long as I've got you here, take me one more minute. I'll just give you a quick Ghost Army news update. In other news, we are actually doing the Ghost Army tour in September, starting September 16th, starting in England and going all the way to Germany, going through a couple of days in Normandy, visiting Reims, visiting the Battle of the Bulge battlefield. I think there's probably still room. If you're interested in that, please don't hesitate to contact Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. I just got to visit Brest in Brittany the other day and was toured around the Ghost Army sites in Brest, which we've mapped out, such that I can tell you, this is exactly where Task Force X in the Brest Deception, Task Force X, led by Major Oscar Seal, or maybe it was Captain Oscar Seal. This is exactly where they were in this farm field. We were really able to pinpoint it. And it's just been very exciting as we go and visit these places to literally be able to walk now and say we know they were right here, that this is exactly where it happened. And again, I'm putting this mapping information up on our Ghost Army Legacy Project website so that other people can do that as well. And then last news item, in September, we are going to be dedicating a Ghost Army historical marker in Bettenberg. We're bringing the tour there for the dedication. And again, I have done a lot of mapping that you can see using the maps that I found in the archive, laying them over modern maps, matching things up so we could pinpoint the exact spot where the deception took place. And when I was there a few weeks ago, met with folks from the U.S. Embassy and from the commune of Bettenberg to do that. So that is pretty much all I have to say now, and I am now available for the next half hour or until the questions run out to answer any questions people have. So please feel free to type them in, and we'll try to get to them in order as best we can. I need the Jeopardy theme to play now. Did any of the intelligent generals ever raise a question over their overcommitment to thinking the invasion would take place via the Pas de Calais? Well, there were certainly people who questioned it from time to time. Even Hitler questioned from time to time. After having the whole build-up in Pas de Calais, he suddenly said Normandy's going to be the spot. Let's defend Normandy. But in the end, that was a sort of a temporary aberration. He went back to thinking it was Pas de Calais. And it doesn't seem like the Germans really were able to, that anybody really had sussed that out. It really was a tremendous operational success by the Allied forces. And interestingly enough, it extended even after the D-Day invasion. The continuance of Operation Fortitude helped convince the Germans that the invasion in Normandy was a feint, right? So they turned it around to make it seem like what's happening in Normandy, that's just something to distract you, and then we're going to attack Pas de Calais. So this deception really worked for a long time. I have to now find the next question here. Was there a British equivalent of the Ghost Army? Yes and no. And so the yes is this. The British did tactical deceptions in North Africa. Specifically, there were tactical deceptions that were part of the Battle of El Alamein in November of 1942. Operation Bertram was a deception that used decoys and other means to fool the Germans about where the British tanks were, that they were on one part of the battlefield instead of another part. It is different from the Ghost Army because it wasn't a dedicated unit, it wasn't a multimedia unit in the way the Ghost Army was, it wasn't a mobile deception unit that could move around and carry out different deceptions. It was really just involved in doing one deception. I have also heard uh, and read that there may have been a British deception unit with only inflatables, not with sonic or radio or the other means that operated in Europe. I have not been able to get any information on it at this time. I think there may also have been some British use of inflatables in Italy. But what really makes the Ghost Army stand out as unusual is the fact that it's multimedia and that it is designed to be able to be in action here for 3 or 4 days, fold up, move 200 miles away, and be in action, way over here a few days later. And that combination of mobile, multimedia, and tactical is really unique, and the Germans did not have that, or the British. Will Congress grant the gold medal to the Ghost Army or do nothing as usual? Well, Mr. Tillery and others, we are lobbying Congress. It is slow going, not only because of the political deadlock, but just because it's always slow going with Congress. We have some initiatives that we've been working on that regarding this over the summer that I'm not prepared to talk about yet, but we're hoping to make a new push in the fall. I honestly think this is going to be a long-term effort. Each year we're gaining ground and getting a little further, and that the more, it's really not up to me. It's really up to all the people who are interested in this, contacting their congressmen, everybody trying to work toward it and make it happen, because congressmen, congresswomen, senators all respond to constituent pressure. And the more constituent pressure there is, the more they jump and respond to that. So hopefully we will get this to happen at some point, but it may take a while. Bob Dawes mentions the war magician. He's talking about Jasper Maskelyne, who was a British deception a genius, some might say, or maybe not so much of a genius, some might say. But Jasper Maskelyne came from a family of magicians and was very involved in British deceptions in North Africa, and then wrote a book in which he basically claimed credit for a huge amount of stuff, some of which may have happened, much of which may not have happened. But he was involved in British deceptions. He's a fascinating guy. There's been talk of a movie being made about him starring Benedict Cumberbatch, but I heard a little bit about it a few years ago, but I haven't heard anything about it since then. Okay. Familiar with U.S. deception ops in the Pacific? Not really. I'm not very familiar with that. The Ghost Army was scheduled to go to the Pacific, but once the dropped the atomic bomb, obviously that didn't happen. There were some naval deceptions in the Pacific, and I have been given some information about them, but I don't have it. It's not top of mind at the moment. It's a much different tactical situation than the battlefields of Europe, so obviously they would have had to have been very, very different kinds of deception. Okay. In the movie The Longest Day, one of the German commanders in Normandy is shown the night of June 5th getting suspicious. Is this a reasonably accurate portrayal of the situation among the German commanders in Normandy the evening of June 5th? Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I mean, once stuff starts to happen, of course, once paratroopers start to come down, once these huge flights of airplanes are coming over, people's suspicions are aroused that something is happening. But in the end, even if it shook people on a 1-star, 2-star general level in Normandy to convince them that this was a real thing happening here, it certainly did not have that kind of impact with the Fuhrer and with his advisors way behind the lines, who of course took quite a long time to release the panzer divisions behind the lines, and really never engaged in the furious buildup that you would expect if they thought that this was the do-or-die fight. So I think that, sure, obviously if you look at each of the individual commanders, you probably see the the dawning recognition coming to each one at a different point in the timeline. And I imagine that that began almost as soon as there were reports of paratrooper landings. But they didn't do very much. I mean, again, the Germans could have activated units very quickly at midnight or 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. and had been much more ready than they were when the actual invasion force showed up on the beaches at 5:30 or 6 a.m. in the morning. All right, so I do not see any more questions here at this point. I'll hang on a moment. I appreciate everybody coming. I'm always available. If you're interested in this, you can always contact me through the Ghost Army website or by email. We're always interested in trying to find ways to talk to more people about this. I'm going to be doing a big Midwest speaking tour in October. Always looking for new opportunities to talk about the Ghost Army. So thank you very, very much for coming. Thanks a lot.